churches in our district. Just kidding. What is there, about 50 churches?
There's 78 churches.
All right, I didn't even see 78 churches that Mark oversees. He's what you would call a boss to me also. And you think, well, that's not, what does it mean, you know? It's a big deal. He gets the joy of making sure I stay somewhat under control. I think a lot of you know that takes a little bit of work. He has to oversee quite a bit. But in the middle of the summer, I called Pastor Mark and I said, I think it'd be really cool if you could come and preach every so many years at Grace Church, because that way they know who you are, they know how to reach you, and they know what you do, kind of. Just get you out here. And of course, we decided not every year. Just kidding. It's got a lot on his plate, but you're going to hear from him every now and then. It's a goal for Pastor Mark and I to have that kind of happen. It's just a fun relationship. But today I introduce him to you, Pastor Mark Miller, our superintendent.
Thank you, Bob. Well, I do greet you on behalf of Bishop O and those 78 churches in the district, or I guess 77 other churches. And we are bound together across Minnesota. Our district runs all the way to Canada, from Ely to Thief River Falls, and down to Appleton and Litchfield. Those are kind of the boundaries. So our district is about half of the state geography-wise, obviously not population-wise. But I bring you greetings, and I thank you for the invitation to preach. This morning, I want to talk about expectations. And expectations of God, expectations of the church, expectations of this Christmas season. Have any of you ever had some relatives that you always knew what they were going to give you for Christmas? So you could just expect the same thing over and over again. When I was 10, 11 years old, I was the oldest of the children, all the grandchildren in the whole family. And they decided that at 10 or 11 years old, I was too old for toys anymore. And so I had to get some kind of other gift for Christmas. And my single uncle, he thought that what every 10-year-old boy needs is a box of cheese. You know, do you remember the old cheese boxes that had all the processed cheese, little tiny squares, and maybe if you were lucky you got a little summer sausage about like this? Well, he started giving me a box of cheese for Christmas every year. Every year I got cheese. Now, actually that wasn't too bad. I like cheese. His sister, my aunt, on the other hand, she worked in the men's department at JCPenney's. And she gave me socks and underwear. There is nothing more that a 10-year-old boy wants than to have the entire family gathered around to watch you open up and then hold up your tighty-whities. And this isn't just once, because you know it's going to happen again and again and again every Christmas as we gathered. I knew what to expect. It was cheese and socks and underwear every year. But you know that first Christmas, Mary and Joseph didn't know what to expect. They weren't expecting any of that. Even if Joseph had been studying the scriptures and had been reading faithfully through Isaiah, he wouldn't have understood it. Yeah, he would have seen chapter 7, where it says a virgin shall conceive and bear a child. But then he also would have come across chapter 64. I don't know if it flashes by so quickly when it's read on a Sunday morning. Encourage you to go back sometime and look at that, because this too is part of the scriptures and what people look for. So in verse 64, Isaiah is saying, "Oh God, that you would come down from the heavens that you would come down. See, that's Christmas. God, that you would come down. So that the mountains would quake at your presence. See, that's what he's expecting. God, come down and shake the mountains. Come down like that. Now, why does he expect that? It says, in verse 3, when you did awesome deeds that we did not expect, you came down and the mountains quaked at your presence. So what he's asking is, Lord, come down and surprise us and do it just the way you did it before. So we know what to expect this time. Lord, come down and shake the mountains. Little did Joseph or anyone else expect that the Lord would come down, but not to shake the mountains, but to come as a little child in a barn full of animals, to come as a Savior who'd give his life on the cross for us. God is always doing more than our expectations. God is always surprising us, doing things that are far beyond what we could ask or think. That was true not only in the time of Mary and Joseph, but it was also true in the life of the founder of the United Methodist Church, the Methodist movement at the time, John Wesley. Anybody heard of him?
Yeah.
John Wesley? All right. So we're here because John Wesley was there back in the 1700s. And this branch of God's wonderful, diverse, amazing church was started because of some things that happened, particularly to a man named John Wesley. Now, you might have heard some of his story, but I want to tell you a little bit about the beginning. He was a priest in the Church of England. And I guess you could say he was a little uptight. He was a guy, he grew up in a preacher's family, and he grew up doing things by the books. He kept journals. He would hourly rate his spiritual temperature, if you will, how close he was to God and where he'd slipped up. I mean, he just put that down every hour of the day. It's the guy that knew what to expect and had all sorts of expectations, and he would write them down. So this is the 1700s. This is the colonies and the starting of America. So he felt God calling him to come to America and to share the grace and the love of Jesus Christ with the Native Americans. But given the kind of person that he was, once he got here, it was just a whole lot more comfortable to stay in the little colonial church there rather than actually get out and meet those Native Americans. And so he was a dismal flop when it came to evangelism, because he spent all his time inside the church there rather than the whole reason that he'd come, which was to reach a whole new world with the grace and love of Jesus Christ. Also, in his rule keeping, got him in a bit of trouble, because one communion time, an ex-girlfriend of his came forward for communion. Now, there were certain things you were supposed to do at the time in order to get ready for communion, and she hadn't done that. So, when she came down for communion, he said, "Well, I'm sorry, you can't have any, you didn't follow the rules." Needless to say, her father, who was a bigwig in the colony, was not pleased, and John had to basically ship off in the middle of the night to escape his wrath. And he headed back to England, and he was discouraged, he was depressed, he was even doubting his faith. You know, I went to America to save the people there, and who's going to save me, he thought. Now you may have heard the next step in the story, because he goes to a small group meeting on Aldersgate Street. And there, as he's listening, he says his heart was strangely warmed. And he knew the grace and the love of Christ for himself. He actually knew that in his heart. His heart was strangely warmed. And many people say that's the starting of the Methodist movement, the Aldersgate experience. But you know, I would say that was the start of his experience of a heartfelt faith. What really started the church happened a year later, when a friend of his, George Whitfield, was getting outside the churches and sharing Jesus' love with people wherever they were, out in the fields, out in the workplaces. And of course, John Wesley knew that that just wasn't proper, because Jesus had to stay inside the church. That's where you do church things. I want to read you from his journal. I said he was a bit compulsive and he kept these journals and everything. So you can go back and read, because this is what happened on Saturday, March 31st, 1739. He said, "In the evening I reached Bristol and met Mr. Whitfield there. I could scarcely reconcile myself at first to this strange way of preaching in the fields, of which he set me an example on Sunday. I had been all my life, till very lately, so tenacious of every point relating to decency and order, that I should have thought the saving of souls almost a sin if it hadn't been done inside a church." He was so obsessed with decency and order that he almost thought it a sin if you saved a soul outside the church. But God's Spirit was working. And 2 days later, on Monday the 2nd, he says, at 4 p.m, I submitted to be more vile and proclaimed in the highways the glad tidings of salvation, speaking from a little eminence in a ground adjoining the city to about 3,000 people. And he preached from Isaiah. That's really what started the United Methodist Church. We were started by someone whose heart was strangely warm, and then whom the Spirit moved outside of the church to reach people where they were. And why? Because that's where they were. In the time of John Wesley, only about 1 in 4 or 1 in 5 people went to church. Do you know how many Minnesotans go to church? About 1 in 4 or 1 in 5. And researchers who've studied the 1700s in England, they said it was a time of a constantly decreasing number of people who went to church. And of the people that did go to church, they went to church less frequently than in previous years. Does that sound like anything? That's our country today. Decreasing number of people who go to church, and of those who do go to church, a decreasing frequency of their gathering for worship. So it was in a time just like ours that God moved John Wesley, the original Methodist, to go out to where the people were, to share the grace and the love of Jesus Christ. John Wesley was surprised, and I don't know what surprised him more, that he found himself preaching out in the fields and in the parks and in the business places of the world, where that 3,000 people would show up for his very first sermon. Far more than would ever fit in the churches where he was preaching. See, God does the unexpected. God shows up in our lives and in our churches and moves us out to reach the world with the grace and love of Jesus Christ. You know, one of the things that you'll be voting on here are the HCI recommendations of what is our future going to look like. And you know, we can't know that precisely, because God is going to surprise us. But one of the recommendations is that we make grace the heart of everything that we do, and taking that out to others, and sharing it in our worship and in our activities throughout the Paynesville area. And of course, I know that you also go way beyond Paynesville because you're involved in missions, and you go all over the place to share that grace and love of Christ. Those Christmases long ago, I knew just exactly what to expect. I was going to get cheese and socks and underwear, without fail. This Christmas, I don't know what to expect, but I do know that the promises of Emmanuel, God with us, God with us when we gather and worship in this church, God with us when we go out to the Lake Coronas and worship there, God with us when we're at our work, God with us when we're out in our fields, God with us. So will you make grace the heart of everything you do? Will you follow the movement of the Spirit like your forefather John Wesley? Will you trust, like Mary and Joseph, that as strange and as wild as what God is asking you to do, that God will be with you? Emmanuel, God with us. I pray that you will have an exciting and wonderful Advent, and as we celebrate the old story